Okay, good morning and welcome. And welcome to those who are tuning in on the podcasts. This is the third session of our 9-session series on the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're using as a resource this book, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, Revealing the Jewish Roots of Christianity by John Bergsma. For those tuning into the podcast, a couple of items. First of all, thank you for joining us. We have now sent out an email with all of the PowerPoint presentations that the live audience is watching so that those on the podcast can follow along with those slide presentations as they're listening to the podcast. So if we have two distribution lists going, if you did not receive the email with the PowerPoint presentations and you're listening to the podcast, please email or text me so that I can add you to our distribution list. I'm lperson5@cox.net, and you can text or call me at 480-620-6968. And give me your contact information and we'll add you to our distribution list. I'm going to welcome the live audience now. Welcome on this Ash Wednesday. I was thinking, traditionally in Lent, we give up something, don't we? For 40 days and stuff like that. And I remember always thinking, what an extreme sacrifice it is, go 40 days without X, Y, and Z or whatever, because it was usually, I'm going to give up something for Lent. Think about these Essenes who took these oaths that were lifelong, and they couldn't break them. And the story that Josephus gives is that the Essenes who committed some bad sin could be ostracized from the group. And even when they were ostracized, they would still abide by their oath, and all of their oaths. And one of them was that they couldn't eat any food that was prepared by anyone except the communal kitchen. And so they had to eat, as Josephus says, grass, or as John the Baptist did, honey and locusts. And that, because that was not considered prepared food, that was sort of naturally occurring stuff, and you could eat that. But Josephus says that these ostracized Essenes from the Qumran community would actually come real close to just starving to death. And then the community would sometimes have mercy on them and accept them back into the community, figuring that they had done their penance, and then they could start eating again. But so in Lenten season, I marvel at these Essenes and the commitments that they made in their life. So in the previous 2 episodes of this series, we began with the marvelous discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What an amazing story that is. And then we looked at the archaeology, both of the Qumran ruins and also the archaeology in the 11 caves where the scrolls were actually found. Then in the second session last week, we really looked at the Essenes themselves. How do we know about them? What are the sources that tell us about the Essenes? Who were they? What was their lifestyle? What did they believe? What did they teach? What were their favorite scriptures? And they were different than what we know as ours, and different from the Jewish scriptures as well. And then I warned you that this morning we were going to go down a rabbit hole, and I was going to ask you to go down that rabbit hole with me. And so that's where we are right now. We're on session 3. Let me begin, if you want to flip to the next slide, Jeff, with this. Do you believe in coincidences, by the way? My wife says there are no such things as coincidences. About 2 weeks ago, I was doing some yard work in the front of my house, and a young man came walking by, walking his dog. He was probably like in his mid-20s, something like that. very friendly. So he stopped to say hello, and I said, "Hi, how are you?" And he said, I've been here just a short time in this area, and I've been walking around, and the neighbors here are really friendly. And I thought, oh, I got to live up to this. So I said, well, where did you move from? And he said, well, I was born in Israel. My parents are academics. I'm assuming university professors. We moved to first New York City, and then 8 months ago we moved here. So I've been here just 8 months. And he said, I'm also, I become a Christian, but I come at it from a more academic intellectual standpoint kind of thing. And I said, after he said all this, I went back to the first thing he said, which was I was born in Israel. I said, I studied in Israel a while. Where was your home in Israel? And he told me the city, village, but I didn't catch exactly what it was. I don't know where it was. But he said it was close to Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv is right on the coast, right on the Mediterranean, so the western part of Israel. And then he asked me, well, what did you study? And where? And I said, I went to the American Institute of Holy Land Studies in Jerusalem, just outside the walls of the old city, and I was studying archaeology and geography. And his eyes just lit up. Now, he is one of these people that if you get onto a topic that he is really vested in and really loves, you will not get a word in edgewise. An hour later, our conversation ended, and he did most of the talking. But a lot of what he talked about first of all, he started out with, well, these are some of my favorite authors that I kind of follow. And he mentioned Bart Ehrman. And you may remember from our readings now in chapter 7, Bart Ehrman is the atheist theologian who is the feature in chapter 7 of our book. And then he said, I also, so that was my first clue where he was going to come from. The second clue was he started into this, well, I'm a JEDP theorist. I believe in the hypothetical, or the documentary hypothesis. And then he had just this amazing mind, great memory for detail. And he was listing some things that were, in his view, anachronisms that proved that the JEDP theory was correct and not the Bible or what the Bible says or anything like that. And one of the things that he mentioned was that camels did not exist in 1200 BC when Moses wrote the Pentateuch and things like that, and therefore the Bible was untrue. And he went on and he listed several other, in detail, sort of attacks on the veracity of the Bible. For those of you who don't know what the JEDP theory is and the documentary hypothesis, this is something from the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. These theorists say that Moses did not write the 5 books of the Pentateuch. The Bible says that he wrote it. It says that. The prophets all attribute his writings to Moses. Jesus said Moses wrote all 5 books. He quotes all 5 of them and says Moses was the author. And New Testament writers also say that Moses wrote it. But JEDP theorists say, no, it wasn't written by Moses. It was written by, and this is where it gets kind of wonky, at least 4 different individuals or schools of thought. And because this JEDP theory is so old, it has been attacked by or countered by so many different theologians over the years. The JEDP theory has turned into the J1, J2 DPE theory and the EE2 and all kinds of iterations. Everything from 4 to 7 or more authors of it. And the initials JEDP stand for, J stands for Jehovah or Yahweh, which is one of the names of God in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis. And so the theory is that whoever contributed one group of that was whoever used the name Jehovah or Yahweh in their writings. Then E stands for Elohim, another name for God in the Old Testament. So whoever wrote that part of it combined with whatever passages we see in the Old Testament where Elohim is the name for God that is used, that portion was written by that group or that individual. So they got pieced together. Then there's the D, that's the Deuteronomistic. So whoever wrote Deuteronomy, because that is seen as being quantitatively different from a linguistic standpoint than the other books. So that was added in. And then the P stands for priestly. So anything that you see in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy that has to do with the workings of the temple and the duties of the high priest and anything that a priest might be interested in kind of thing was contributed. So those kind of four sources came together and formed what we now know as the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as we put it in the Protestant church. It was written not in 1200 BC, but in the period from 1200 to about 400 BC was when it finally ended. Now, again, it's been totally debunked. In the first place, the prophets, Old Testament prophets, quoted it in that interim period when it was sort of still being formed as if it was already there full blown, and so the theory just doesn't hold water. So I said to this young man, well, that's kind of dated, don't you think? And he was, well, I'm a neo-JEDP theorist. And I was like, yeah, isn't everybody these days? I mean, nobody believes in the original one. They all have offshoots because every time another scholar puts a hole in some of their argumentation, they change their theory. And in essence, JEDP theory is unfalsifiable. You can't prove it's false. It's just a theory. But his bottom line was the JEDP theory proves that the Bible is inaccurate. And I looked at him like, since when does a theory, especially one that isn't supported by empirical evidence, prove anything? It's just a theory. But anyway, that was his deal. So he was attacking the veracity of the Bible throughout. And I was wondering, Jeff, if you want to switch to the next slide, have any of you ever had an encounter like I did 2 weeks ago? I had another one a couple months ago with my dentist, but that's beside the point. But have you ever had someone say to you, a friend or a relative or something like that, someone you love or someone you've just met, the Bible's full of errors, or the Bible writers contradict themselves, or Paul didn't really write the New Testament letters that are attributed to him, someone else did, or we don't have the original word of God, the Bible has changed from its original wording, or the books of the New Testament were written in the 2nd and 3rd century. And I know that in our Bible study, we sometimes consult our sources, and we come up with those kinds of numbers, basically saying that the Bible wasn't written by who it was written by. It was written somewhat later by someone else who is unnamed. Or the Old Testament was not written at first, so centuries of word of mouth changed it completely before it was actually written down. Do any of you do you have anything you'd like to share? Have anybody had an experience? I see a lot of nodding heads. I don't know if you want to share your experience, but hold on. Let's get a microphone here so they can hear on the podcast.
The husband of our niece is very much one who will say that the Bible can't be true because there are so many things in the Bible that are mentioned that are impossible. Mm-hmm. And my only response was that with God, all things are possible.
That's a good answer. That's a good answer. Anybody else want to share anything? I'm sure, everybody was sort of nodding, so I'm sure you've all had kind of experiences about that. So on the next slide, Jeff, if you will, I'm focusing in on what's called apologetics. So I went to seminary, so I got seminary training. I took a couple courses on apologetics, so I know about this. But apologetics basically is the theological discipline of defending religious doctrines through systematic, rational argumentation. And it can be anything from proof that God exists or that God created the earth to proof that these, as Ron mentioned, the inerrancy of the Bible is to be questioned. There's something wrong. There's a lie in there. There's an inconsistency in there. We're going to look at that today. Apologetics covers kind of all of that. And the point that I wanted to make is that this book, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls by John Bergsma, has a big portion of the book which I would regard as basically apologetics. And that's why I wanted to go down this rabbit hole just to cover those sections of the book in which he does this. So all of our readings and chapters for today are basically apologetics. The one chapter of reading for today that isn't an attack on the veracity of the Bible by an external source, which is what we're going to talk about, is actually chapter 15, where it talks about the Reformation and the church unity kinds of issues. And basically what Bergsma is pointing out in that chapter is that the Christian church has, in a sense, shot itself in the foot on that one. It's our own fault. It's an internal problem. Now, we are Lutherans, so our namesake, Martin Luther, started the Reformation. And we all consider that a good thing, because Martin Luther corrected what he saw as an errant theory of the church, if you will, or belief system of the church, and in that salvation is by faith alone, not by works, lest any man should boast, right? That's what we always say. And what Bergsma has said is that in essence, we have taken that too far now. And what about passages that you read in the Bible that say things like, you must believe and be baptized? Well, isn't being baptized like a work? Or what about the book of James, where he talks about, show me your faith, I'll show you my works, kind of thing. So the Bible contains both of those concepts. And what Bergsma points out is that the Essenes kind of dealt with this same issue of faith and works. And the way they talked about it is very instructive for us as Christians. And if we kind of followed their line of thinking, there might be more unity in the church. We might stop, saying, well, Lutherans are right and the Baptists are wrong, or the Methodists are right and the Lutherans are wrong, or whatever it is we say, and to stop all this denominational disunity and maybe unify the church again. Maybe there's a basis for doing it in what the Essene church said. And basically what they were saying was that the issue in when Paul says, salvation is by faith, not by works, what he was referring to was if you are thinking about my eternal state, where am I going to be? How am I going to get there? You're going to get there by faith. You're not going to get there by following the works of the law. You still have to do good works, and that's a proof that your faith is real, if you will. But if you rely instead of on faith in God, if you rely on following the law of the Old Testament and doing all of the works that are required under the law, and that's all you do, that is not the pathway to heaven. And there's a big difference between saying don't do that and saying don't do good works. So you still do good works, and it's still required of us. So faith and good works are still a requirement of all Christians. It's not faith alone. And that's where we've gone to an extreme. So again, chapter 15 is more about, and we're familiar with all these arguments, is more about an internal shooting ourselves in the foot. But on the next slide, so much of this book is focused on apologetics, I think, for a good reason. I think that the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essene belief system is the motherlode of evidence to answer all kinds of criticism and attacks on the veracity of the Bible and so forth. And that's why Bergsma spends so much time on it. And the point that he's trying to make throughout the book is that many of these theories that are still popular in the seminaries and the big institutions in the United States and in academics are still these old theories that archaeology, and especially Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, has just absolutely proven they're not accurate. They're not a good description of what happened, and they should be discarded. But they're not. These are still active theories in academia. JEDP theory is still the major theory that's taught in most academic institutions, even though it's been totally debunked. So for that reason, because this evidence is just momentous, that's why Bergsma spends all this time on apologetics. So on the next slide, I want to look at this morning just two examples from Bergsma's book in a little bit of depth, just sort of summarize what he has said to be clear. You made a real good comment this morning, Phyllis, when you said, I couldn't wait to get out of that chapter because I got so lost in the details, and it's hard to follow. So I just wanted to follow along, and for us to think about the next time someone attacks the Bible or our faith in front of us, are we ready to give an answer? Now, this is just two examples, so there's no way I can cover all of the questions and things that would come up in your life. But this is just a one way of approaching some of these attacks that happen in the Bible. And I wanted to cover just a couple of major examples. They are in chapter 7, when was the Last Supper? And chapter 14, did Paul write Ephesians or anything about the church? So let's start on the next slide with chapter 7. When was the Last Supper is the big question. And this is where Bart Ehrman, my neighbor's favorite theologian, comes in, because he's listed as using this discrepancy in the Bible as a proof that the Bible is not to be trusted. It's just not true. It's got all kinds of errors in it, and you can't really rely on the Bible. So this is one of Ehrman's key issues. And the issue is this. In the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as opposed to the Gospel of John, there are two different, it's actually day discrepancies between when did Mary anoint Jesus' feet and then when did the Passover occur. Right after that happened. In the synoptics, it takes place the Passover takes place 2 days after Mary anoints Jesus' feet. But in John's gospel, it takes place 6 days before the Passover meal is celebrated. So, which is it? Who's lying? Who's wrong? Where is the Bible inaccurate? This certainly, on the face of it, this absolutely sounds like a discrepancy. 2 does not equal 6. So which is right, which is wrong? Or is there a possible way to look at it another way and say, neither one of us wrong, even though it looks like a discrepancy up front? And that's what Bergsma is doing in the book. The way he approaches it, first of all, is to say, back in the Second Temple period, in Jesus' day, when these books of the Bible were written, there were actually multiple liturgical calendars in operation in Judaism. In the Essene community, they operated under a solar calendar. And Bergsma points out there are passages in the Damascus document and in the rule of the community that say the year is, it literally says 364 days. So that's the calendar, the solar calendar that we know of. However, in the temple state of Israel at the time, the Second Temple period, the Hasmoneans had taken over both the kingship and the chief priest of the temple roles, and they sided with the Pharisees more than with the Essenes or anything like that. And the Pharisees and the Hasmoneans used a lunar solar calendar of 254 days. And then every few years they had to catch up with an extra month to catch up and keep the calendar in tune with the seasons, kind of thing. So there were at least 2 different calendars, liturgical calendars, that is, calendars that would say this is going to be the date. Just like we have different liturgical calendars for Easter, for example. Easter is celebrated by us on one date and by others on different dates. This is the same thing was happening in the Second Temple period. And Bergsma says further on, there were probably even more liturgical calendars. So the Samaritans, for example, didn't even worship in Jerusalem. They had their own temple in Mount Gerizim, and they had a different liturgical calendar, and we're not really certain when they celebrated Passover, but they came out of the Jewish roots as well, so they would have celebrated Passover, but the question is when. So the point is that there were at least 2 different liturgical calendars operative during this time, and that the various authors are referencing this event of Mary washing or anointing Jesus' feet according to one liturgical calendar as opposed to the other liturgical calendar. So what's the evidence for that? Is it true that that's what's going on, and that could explain this apparent discrepancy? Well, we've talked about the importance of the Essene quarter and the upper room, which was in the Essene quarter, and the safety of the Essene quarter for Jesus when he was being attacked by the followers of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they wanted to kill him, and they were looking for an opportunity to arrest him, and all those other things. He always found refuge in going to the Essene quarter, where they weren't trying to arrest him and attack him. It was sort of a safe haven kind of thing. And we saw that Jesus told his disciples, go into the city, you see a man carrying a jar of water, that's an Essene. He's going to take you to the house that has a guest room where I want you to set up for the Passover meal. That's John Mark's mother's house. And the Essenes were famous for being very, very hospitable, and they always maintained a guest house so that travelers or injured people or sick people or poor people could find refuge and a help and a place to stay and things like that. And if the Essenes required that if they worked and had a wage, that a portion of that wage had to go toward the maintenance of this guest house. So we knew that Essenes had guests' houses. So all of this evidence seems to point to the fact that Jesus went and spent Passover in the Essene quarter. We're going to see in some later sessions that it kind of makes sense too, because several of Jesus' disciples, of his 12 disciples, had some Essene influences and knew the Essenes and were acquainted with them and so forth. They were not themselves Essenes per se, but so there were all these connections. So Jesus would have said to an Essene person, we're going to celebrate the Passover on your liturgical calendar day of Passover, and I need your house on that day to do that, to celebrate with my disciples. So Jesus would have celebrated on the day of the week would have been Tuesday, and that would have been 2 days after Mary anointed Jesus' feet with oil. Furthermore, there's more evidence that Bergsma brings out. The traditional site of the cenacle, or the upper room, is located this is from archaeological evidence, is also located in this Essene area. And we talked a little bit about the other archaeological evidence about the Essene gate, an ancient gate on the outside wall of Jerusalem. There was an Essene gate, and archaeologists had found just outside the Essene gate several mikvah, these ceremonial washing stations, and a latrine, because the Essenes who lived in Jerusalem, in the camp in Jerusalem, not the ones in Qumran, but the ones that lived in Jerusalem in the city, they regarded the whole city as being holy because it had the temple in it. In the same way, the Essenes that lived at Qumran regarded their whole compound as being holy, as being the temple, not only that, but the Holy of Holies. The point being that the Essenes that lived in Jerusalem would have wanted to maintain holiness personally as much of the time as they possibly could, and never intentionally break that. That's why most of them were probably celibate, number one, because if you had sexual relations with your wife, that made you unholy for about 3 days before you could come back into the temple and serve in the temple. So you wouldn't do anything that would intentionally make you unholy. So the other things that might make you unholy, besides sexual relations with your wife, would be just simply if you had to go to the bathroom. So that's why it's so important that the latrine, as well as the mikvah washing stations, where you would cleanse yourself to make yourself clean again, and then come back into the city, while they were just outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Basically, imagine being an Essene and living in Jerusalem. Every time you had to go to the bathroom, you had to leave the city to do it. But anyway, that was the practice. So the fact that there was an Essene gate right at this Essene quarter, the upper room traditionally has been there. All this evidence from the New Testament that Jesus had Essene followers and had connections with the Essenes and used that upper room and that house and so forth, all point to Jesus practicing according to the liturgical calendar of the Essenes. So 2 days after he was anointed, his feet were anointed by Mary, thank you, Mary, he then celebrated Passover with his disciples. On the other hand, John is using the official liturgical calendar of the temple state of Israel. What's the evidence for that? The evidence for that starts with, first of all, that's the one used by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and then in the temple. But the evidence for that is, first of all, John has this peculiar expression that's unique to John, where he says, the Passover of the Jews, in several places in his gospel. Now, why is that peculiar? It's a redundancy. Of course, the Passover is of the Jews. It's like saying the 4th of July of the Americans. I mean, duh, we're the only ones that celebrate the 4th of July. Of course it's the Americans. Well, Passover to the Jews does not make sense at all. So Bergsma looks at the original language, the Greek, and what he sees is that John is using the word Judeans. He's saying the Passover of the Judeans as opposed to the Passover of the Israelites or the Passover of the Samaritans. He is acknowledging by saying Passover of the Judeans that there is more than one Passover liturgical date. So he's specifying which Passover date, liturgical date, is being used when he's referring to this issue of when did Mary anoint Jesus' feet, and then why does he say then it was 6 days later? Because they would have practiced according to the Jewish state, they would have practiced Passover on Saturday, and of course it starts on nightfall at dusk the night before, so Friday night. So that's the discrepancy. Furthermore, to illustrate this on the next slide, Bergsma says, I want you to think about this. After Jesus was arrested and before he was actually crucified, there were a number of events that took place. 12 of them specifically he calls out in the readings that we had for today. You know, he appeared before Annas. He appeared before Pilate. He appeared before Antipas. He had multiple appearances there. He was flogged. He was brought out into the public. They had a big hearing, and then they had the final hearing and so forth. All of these 12 different things happened. Well, think about this. If Jesus had been arrested on Friday night, which is when he got arrested, the night after he celebrated the Passover is when they went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was arrested at that point. They would have had a total of about 12 hours if you were following the liturgical calendar that's listed in John as being how much time between his arrest and his crucifixion and when he would have been taken down from the cross. 12 hours is not a lot of time for all 12 of those events. They were very lengthy, and obviously the Bible talks about how Herod specifically wanted to release Jesus, so he was negotiating and going back and forth, and all these negotiations took place. Whereas if Jesus had been arrested on Tuesday instead, then it would have made more sense for the Pharisees and the Sadducees to say, well, we've got a few days here to get him convicted, put him on a cross, crucify him, and get him off the cross. And then, as they said, they got real anxious about the fact that Jesus was going to hang on his cross during the Sabbath. And so they wanted Jesus taken down as soon as possible before he was hanging on a cross on a Sabbath, which would have been anathema to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, yeah, that's all well and good, but according to that dating, though, Jesus was hanging on the cross on Passover, one of their high holy days, and they weren't the least bit concerned about that. They were only concerned about Jesus hanging on the cross on Sabbath. Well, that doesn't make sense. So the bottom line is that none of the rest of the biblical record about these events kind of fall into place that makes sense unless you understand that there were at least two different liturgical calendars at work. And that's the reason it looks like a discrepancy, although it's really not. It's just dating things by two different liturgical calendars. So that is one way that you can address any attack on the veracity of the Bible, is to just put out the current evidence that exists that explain it in a different way. Now, it doesn't prove that Bergsma's calendar theory is correct, but the evidence certainly lines up much better that that is an accurate description of what happened here, rather than just saying, oh, the Bible's in error, throw it out, throw the baby out with the bathwater, kind of thing. So that's Bergsma's point. And again, what Bergsma is saying is that with the information that we learned from the Dead Sea Scrolls about the Essenes and the fact that they practiced by a solar calendar is just a game changer here. It explains a whole lot of things that previously weren't explainable. And I think he's accurate about that. The second example, if we want to go to the next slide now, this is chapter 14. Did Paul write Ephesians or anything at all about the church? This is another type of attack on the Bible. It's totally different from the first one that we talked about, where you're just presenting evidence. New evidence comes up, and once the new evidence is there, you should consider, which of these possibilities really kind of makes the most sense. On this one, this is more about presuppositions. If you have a presupposition and you read a Bible passage, you often you run the risk that you are going to read into the Bible what you think you want it to say, rather than listening to what the Bible says and form your opinion from what the Bible says instead of from your presupposition. And furthermore, if later on someone points out to you that your presupposition is not a good presupposition to hold and gives you all kinds of evidence for it, you would think that a rational person would kind of change their mind. Well, here's a story now about chapter 14. Did Paul write anything about the church? The liberal scholarship has maintained since the late 18th century, early 19th century, that the two things. One is that the early Christians, the disciples, the writers of the Gospels and so forth, believed that Jesus was going to come again soon. They had no inkling of a thought that they needed to set up a church that was going to last for centuries and centuries and centuries, because they thought human history was going to come to a close. The Essene community kind of felt the same way. And then secondly, the liberal scholars also say that we've got this presupposition. And our presupposition is that this is the way history unfolds. And we're applying that to the Bible. And the Bible doesn't unfold the way our theory says it should. So instead of listening to what the Bible says, we're just going to say the parts of the Bible that conflict with our theory, we're going to throw them out. We're going to say they were written later by somebody else, by an editor, somewhat later, and things like that, so that we make sure that our theory fits the Bible. And here's their theory. It's Hegelian. So Hegel was a philosopher. He lived from 1770 to 1831. And his theory was that all of human history kind of unfolded in this way. There was a thesis, there was an idea that someone came up with. Then a group at some point reacted to that and said, no, that's not really right. This is right. That's the antithesis. And then there'd be kind of a conflict between the two, but ultimately it would work itself out into a synthesis, an agreement, a common understanding, a compromise, or whatever. That's the way all human history unfolded. Well, Hegel his philosophy was very popular back in the 19th century and into the 20th century. And Bergsma lists two scholars, Bauer and Bultmann, who took this Hegelian theory and applied it to the Bible. And what they said was the Christian group that started out was a Jewish Christian group that was following the law very strictly. You had to be circumcised and all this other stuff. That's the thesis. Then along came the antithesis. We're talking about Hegel's theory now. And that was Paul and the universal God for the Gentiles as well as for the Jews, and do away with the law. That's the antithesis. So then you see this in the Bible. There's a little bit of a conflict. They have a get together in Jerusalem, a come to Jesus meeting in Jerusalem at one point. And out of it comes the Catholic Church, the Church of our fathers, the Christian fathers, the synthesis. So that's how the Bible stacks up. Well, here's the problem. Ephesians, one of the early, is sort of the poster child for all of this. Ephesians has a lot of stuff about that's churchy, a lot of ecclesiology, setting up the structure of the church. Who's leadership, deacons, and all of these kinds of things. How to keep order in the church. Talks a lot about the church. Well, Paul couldn't write that. He's part of the antithesis. He can't be doing synthesis kind of stuff. He's antithesis. So toss it out. Paul didn't write it. It was written later, 2nd, 3rd century. That's the theory. That's what they do. What Bergsma does with this now is, I think we're going to the next slide. This view of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis then makes these liberal scholars say, this is the bottom, that they date the books later, or they cast doubt on the authorship of certain books of the Bible, or they argue that editors later inserted any material that doesn't fit their hypothesis, or they claim that certain books of the Bible shouldn't even be in the Bible and stuff like that. Those are all the things that they do because of this. And it leads them into doubting the very veracity of the Bible. What can you believe then about the Bible? So it can be very destructive. So, and furthermore, this whole idea that Jesus and he taught his disciples to expect his imminent return, the second coming. So it was Ephesians was written in the 2nd or 3rd century, and it was not written by Paul. Bergsma then says the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls material, shows that there was a group, very similar group. Again, they both had Jewish roots, and they were different. The Essenes were different from Christians, but they were very similar in their Jewish roots. And from their Jewish roots, the Essenes taught in their literature to expect the Messiah to come and actually vindicate us in this lifetime. But at the same time, the Essenes had a very advanced ecclesiology. They had a lot of churchy stuff in their literature. And Bergsma points out all of it. They set up a hierarchy that looked very much like the hierarchy of the Christian church. They laid out liturgical calendars. They order in the church, all kinds of things. So Bergsma is saying, if one group can do it, if the Essenes can hold in some sort of tension the expectation that Jesus is coming again, and you don't need to worry about the future, and we got to set up a church, an organized church. And if they can do that 2 centuries before the New Testament was written, then why can't Paul do the same thing? Why can't Paul also have an imminent expectation that Jesus is coming again, and yet set up an organized church. And I think that his argumentation is very valid. So I think that for the most part now, again, these theories that have come out that have a presupposition, once evidence, and again, as the Essene readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls are just the motherlode of evidence. And if scholars aren't, or people aren't looking at this new evidence and asking the question, what does this new evidence show about some of these old theories or these old criticisms of the Bible? And, let's take those into account. Then you're missing the boat. And for us, it just shows us, we can do the same thing. We can read into the Bible presuppositions. We all carry our own baggage around all the time. And we have to be careful about that. And, and make sure that if anybody in love kind of says, you got a presupposition here, think about this, I think that we should listen. In the same way, I think scholars should be listening when this new evidence comes out and you start comparing movements during this time period, and you see that the very things that they're saying couldn't possibly have happened in the first century in the writing of Ephesians and talking about the church, and say it was happening 200 years before that, so why couldn't it happen there? There's a precedent for it, kind of thing. You have to look at this new evidence. Okay? So these are just two examples of apologetics, of ways that you can address people in your life who might come to you and say something that troubles you about your faith in any way. Apologetics. And we couldn't possibly answer any specific or all of the specific issues that you might have. But I thought it would be instructive for us to look at least these two examples. And then I would just suggest that, first of all, as we're going through this material, this is going to give you a lot of evidence in this book about the Essenes that can be evidence that you can use to respond to someone who might challenge your faith in some way. Even if that's a challenge in your heart, not an actual conversation that you have with someone else, but if something troubles you, I think you can turn to some of this evidence that we're seeing in this book, and that can soften your heart a little bit about these things. There are all kinds, just so you know, there are all kinds of very good books on apologetics that answer every challenge that has ever been levied against the Christian faith and so forth. And I would say, just go to Google apologetics, and you will find all kinds of things. I had two great professors, Clark Pinnock was one of them, but Gleason Archer and I just lost the name of the other one, that taught me apologetics. And they've written books, and you can look at their books as well. But there are many. A famous one from way back is Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. There are just all kinds of apologetics books that you can look to if you want to learn a little bit more about this whole topic of apologetics. Okay, we want to end on time or even a little early if possible, because we're going to have an Ash Wednesday service out here starting at 8 o'clock, so I wanted to make sure that we end on time. And before I see if you have any comments as we're closing, I wanted to preview next week. We have been in these 3 sessions now doing what I consider to be the background material that we all need as a basis for understanding this topic, so that we can now move to the real meat of what we're trying to present here and what Bergsma is presenting here. So we're going to start with that next week. And we're going to look at the topic of Messiah. The Essenes had a dualistic view of messianism. of the messiahs. They had two messiahs, and actually they had an alternative third messiah concept. The Jewish community to this day has a certain view of Messiah, and we in the Christian church have another view of Messiah. And I wanted to just look at those three different views of the Messiah next week. And so next week your reading is going to be a little easier. It's just one chapter. Phyllis, you'll appreciate that. It's only one chapter. But we're going to talk about the Messiah, or Messiahs plural, next week. That's what's on the schedule. And again, that'll be we'll do 5 sessions on specific topics, from characters of the Bible, personalities of the Bible, or topics like communion, the Eucharist, baptism, the Messiah, and so forth. And then we'll look at some characters as well. And then our last session will be kind of a summarization, trying to tie it all together. So that's where we're going for next week. We still have a couple of minutes. Anyone have a comment that they would like to make, or a question that they might have that they would like to ask? And if so, Judy, I'm going to give the mic back to you. Use the mic so that people on the podcast can hear your question, please.
How did you leave things with your neighbor?
Oh, how do we leave things with my neighbor? Well, like I said, he was very friendly, and he was talking about how friendly people in our neighborhood were, so I wanted to make sure that I was friendly throughout. The way we left it is, I went inside the house and grabbed my book and brought it out to him, and he actually took a picture of it on his phone, of the cover of it, and I'm sure, because he's, this is his bent, I'm sure that he bought that book and he's already read it. I'm sure he has. And we both said to one another, we really enjoyed this conversation. This was fun. Let's do this again. I can't wait to see you again, kind of thing. So we left in very good terms. But the interesting thing that, going back to him, when I first said we're using this book by John Bergsma, he thought he knew who Bergsma was. And I had already told him that the JEDP theory that's just old stuff. Don't pay any attention to that. So he said to me, oh, Bergsma, that's an old theory there, kind of thing. And I said, actually, the book was written in 2019. And he goes, what? So that's when I went and got the book. And that's why, so he understood that I was talking about new evidence. Things that he hadn't considered, things that he hadn't been taught, things that he hadn't read from these other authors. And this was totally different for me. So for someone who has this academic bent in the first place, this was intriguing to him. And I really appreciated him. I mean, what a mind he had. He came up with these details about the thing about the camels and all of this other stuff that was like, wow. You really do have academic parents, and you really have followed in their footsteps. So I really appreciated him a lot. So that's kind of the way we left it with my neighbor. Let's pass this up. Phyllis has a comment. Or Dave, did you have one too?
First of all, I have to say no coincidence for sure.
Thank you.
But with all the reading, the one thing that stood out for me and that I was very thankful for was what Jesus said at the Last Supper. According to the Gospel of John, on the night of the Last Supper, Jesus prayed for those who would believe in him, that they would all be one, so that the world may know that Jesus was sent from the Father, John 17:21. When Christians aren't one, the world cannot know the truth about Jesus.
Absolutely. Amen to that.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it was worth reading all the way to the 15th.
Exactly. Yeah, and again, one of the tragedies for us is that the culture around us sees so much division and diversity in the church, and they just sort of laugh at us. You guys, you can't agree on anything, and you all have a different opinion, and you all contradict one another, so why should I even consider Jesus Christ as my Savior. Why should I? And shame on us. Jesus said we should be united. Everyone that believes in Jesus is my brother, my sister. Everyone. They all are. Not only individually, but anyone who professes, they're my brother and my sister. And we should be united. And shame on us for all of the denominationalism that we practice in this country and throughout the world. Ron, did you have a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to say I love being able to look back at the history of this time period. It's eye-opening on so many levels.
Yeah.
But I was struck by a passage from Romans 13:10, that's mentioned on page 216. I've read this before, and for some reason I just passed it over as a nice thought. But
right.
it's so much heavier than that. And I had to call it to Phyllis's attention. I know she was going to read it for herself as she read through the chapters. But I've never been struck by the heaviness, the heavy weight of this. I know very well that Jesus told us that love thy neighbor is the greatest of the commandments. But from Romans 13:10, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. And for the first time, that really struck me for the heavy weight passage that was. And again, I want to thank you, Larry, for this sharing in this way. It's just wonderful.
Ron, you continue to amaze me with your prophetic knowledge. We're going to talk about love in a future session. A lot of this material, we're pointing out the similarities between Essenism and early Christianity. The major difference, in my view, one of the two major differences is the Christian movement teaches that you love everyone. The Essene movement taught that you love your brothers and sisters, but you hate your enemy. You hate your neighbor. You hate others. Anyone who is the other, you hate them. We don't teach love and hate. We teach love because of that verse. Okay, we're done. Thank you, and we'll see you next Wednesday.